London, 1849. Beneath the damp cobblestones and the polite, highly structured society of Victorian England lies a darkness that defies basic human comprehension. We are told from a young age that a church is a place of absolute sanctuary. We believe it is a place where the living seek spiritual peace, and where the dead are respectfully laid to their final, undisturbed rest. But what happens when the floorboards of a holy place begin to bleed? What happens when a devout congregation sings praises to the heavens, entirely unaware of the 12,000 forgotten souls decaying mere inches beneath their boots? This is the story of Enon Chapel. It sat on Clement's Lane, a narrow, suffocating thoroughfare just off the Strand in the heart of London. By the late 1840s, this modest brick building became the center of a scandal so grotesque that the British government spent decades trying to scrub the worst details from the public consciousness. The time period was the early 19th century. London was swelling with the Industrial Revolution, drawing hundreds of thousands of people from the countryside into its crowded, soot-stained streets. Among the key figures of this era was a dissenting minister named Reverend W. House. He was the man who oversaw Enon Chapel, and the man who promised cheap, dignified, and holy burials to the desperate poor of his neighborhood. The central question we must ask today is not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen. How could a cellar no larger than a modest modern home swallow 12,000 human bodies in broad daylight, right in the center of the world's most powerful city? Was this simply the tragic, inevitable result of a rapidly growing metropolis, or was it a highly organized, deeply sinister enterprise that the authorities desperately wanted to hide? The deeper we look into the archives, the more the terrifying truth begins to emerge. To understand the mystery, we must first look at the accepted facts. The official history of Victorian London is often framed as a story of rapid expansion and unfortunate growing pains. The mainstream narrative points to the 1830s and 1840s as a time when London quite literally ran out of room for its dead. The ancient churchyards were overflowing, and the city lacked a centralized, modern cemetery system. According to the history books, Enon Chapel was simply an unfortunate byproduct of this era. Built in 1823, it was originally intended to be a place of worship for a splinter group of Baptists. Reverend House, according to the official narrative, was an overwhelmed but well-meaning minister trying to serve his impoverished community. While the grand cemeteries charged extortionate fees, House offered a burial in his chapel's vault for a mere 15 shillings. The vault beneath the chapel was shockingly small. It measured only 60 feet long and 29 feet wide, with a ceiling just 6 feet high. The accepted story states that over the course of roughly 2 decades, the church simply lost control of its burial practices. Demand was too high. The official records suggest that a lack of regulation led to a tragic, unsanitary oversight. It was framed as an accident of the era, eventually corrected by the sweeping public health reforms of 1849. But when we peel back the layers of this sanitized history, the official explanation begins to fracture. The first crack in the narrative is a simple matter of mathematics. The numbers simply do not align. A cellar of that specific size, even if filled floor to ceiling with no room to breathe, could mathematically hold perhaps a few hundred coffins at most. Yet, the surviving ledgers and later parliamentary investigations confirmed an impossible, staggering number: 12,000 bodies. This is where neutral history gives way to a chilling reality. 12,000 human bodies cannot simply evaporate into the damp London air. They take up space. They have mass. The sheer volume of organic matter and wood required to house 12,000 dead is entirely incompatible with the physical dimensions of the Enon Chapel vault. A local surgeon and sanitary reformer named George Alfred Walker began to document these anomalies. Walker lived nearby and possessed a sharp, investigative mind. He noted the timeline. He noted the physical space. You do not accidentally misplace thousands of bodies. This was not a passive oversight by a bumbling clergyman. It was an active, daily operation of immense proportions. Why was this discovery so important? Because it meant the narrative of accidental overcrowding was a lie. If the vault could not hold the bodies, then bodies were actively being removed. And if bodies were being removed, then someone was operating a massive, illegal disposal network right under the noses of the Metropolitan Police. Let us walk through the doors of Enon Chapel as it was in the late 1830s to see the grim reality. The floorboards separating the worshiping congregation from the burial vault below were not sealed. They were standard, cheap planks, with gaps wide enough to see the total darkness below. During Sunday services, a strange, heavy gas would rise from the floor. It smelled of sweet, metallic decay. Worshippers routinely fainted in the pews, dropping to the floor mid-prayer. The locals called it chapel fever. They believed it was just the bad air of the city, completely ignorant of the fact that they were breathing in the literal decomposition of their former neighbors. Even more disturbing was the Sunday school. Children were taught their scripture and hymns in the very same building. Medical records and local diaries from the time mention a peculiar type of insect, known locally as body bugs. These large, dark flies would crawl up from the floorboards, swarming the children's hair and clothing as they tried to read their Bibles. Through all of this, Reverend House lived right next door. He stood at the pulpit every Sunday. He smelled the rotting flesh. He saw his congregation falling violently ill. He watched the insects crawl across the floor, yet he continued to take the 15 shillings. He continued to accept new bodies every single week, sometimes up to 10 or 12 fresh corpses a day. The deeper we dig into the daily operations of Enon Chapel, the more the Reverend looks less like a man overwhelmed by circumstance, and more like a man running a highly efficient industrial-scale disposal machine. If the vault could only hold a fraction of the bodies, where did the rest of them go? This question opens the door to a side of Victorian London that the history books rarely mention. Is it possible that Enon Chapel was not a traditional cemetery at all, but a processing center? Consider the economic underbelly of the time. Human and animal bone was a highly valuable commodity in the 19th century. It was crushed into dust and used extensively as agricultural fertilizer. It was used to manufacture buttons. It was even burned to create bone char, a crucial ingredient used to refine sugar. What if the truth was far more sinister than a simple, overcrowded crypt? Witnesses from the surrounding alleys, mostly night watchmen and poor vagrants, reported seeing heavy wheelbarrows leaving the chapel under the cover of darkness. They described carts covered in heavy tarpaulins, their wheels groaning under immense weight, moving quietly toward the River Thames. Some modern historical researchers suggest a quiet, highly profitable arrangement with the city's scavengers and bone boilers. Coffins were deliberately dismantled. The wood was entirely repurposed. Neighbors reported that Reverend House used dismantled coffins as firewood in his own home. The smoke billowing from his chimney allegedly carried the distinct, heavy scent of cheap varnish and human remains. The bodies themselves may have been doused in quicklime to accelerate decomposition, then shoveled into sacks and dumped into the river, or quietly sold to the bone crushers. This was a highly lucrative black market. It begs a profound question. Was the good Reverend acting alone, or was he merely a convenient, respectable middleman for a massive underground network that profited immensely off the dead? The most damning evidence comes not from the mainstream newspapers of the time, which often downplayed the severity of the crisis, but from the suppressed and forgotten testimonies gathered by George Alfred Walker. Walker eventually found men who had been directly employed by House. These gravediggers, whose names were quietly buried in obscure parliamentary annexes and never publicized, confessed to a gruesome nighttime routine. They spoke of climbing down into the pit with lanterns. The lanterns would frequently extinguish the moment they crossed the threshold, starved of oxygen by the lethal concentration of decomposition gases. They spoke of hacking apart the older, decaying coffins with pickaxes and shovels to make room for the fresh arrivals. They confirmed that bodies were entirely dismembered, shifting a mountain of human debris from one side of the cellar to the other, just to carve out a few more inches of space for the next paying customer. But perhaps the darkest revelation of all is what happened after the scandal finally broke in 1847. When the government finally stepped in, forced by public outcry and Walker's relentless campaigning, their reaction was incredibly strange. They did not launch a massive criminal investigation into the financial records of Enon Chapel. They did not prosecute Reverend House, who conveniently died before he could face a tribunal. They did not launch a hunt for the missing thousands of bodies. Instead, the chapel was quietly sold. The new owners turned the holy sanctuary into a low-rent dance hall. For years after the supposed cleanup, Victorian Londoners danced the waltz and the polka on the very same floorboards, drinking ale and enjoying their evenings. They danced because the authorities had lied to them. The government had only removed a small fraction of the bodies near the surface to appease the press. The vast majority of the dead were never relocated. They were simply covered with a layer of cheap dirt and brick rubble. The music played on, drowning out the silence of the thousands who remained trapped directly beneath the dancers' feet. We like to believe that history is a straight, logical line. We like to think that the past is a place of recorded truths, reliable archives, and tidy explanations. But the story of Enon Chapel leaves a dark, spreading stain that cannot be easily washed away by the passage of time. 12,000 people walked down the steps of a holy sanctuary in the middle of a modern city, and they disappeared into a nightmare of commerce, deception, and decay. We are told by the official records that it was just the tragic consequence of a crowded city, a simple tragedy of the times. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of unfortunate accidents, driven by poverty, desperation, and remarkably poor civic planning. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize. Maybe they saw that in the shadows of the greatest, most advanced empire on Earth, human life was just another disposable currency. And that some secrets are so incredibly dark, the only way the world can handle them is to bury them right beneath our feet.